morning, everybody. And I don't answer to almost any name, just the two, Before I get started, Jennifer has been nice enough to allow me to announce that ABC Research is sponsoring some research travel grants. So this is free money. There are 3 $500 research travel grants for anybody doing produce research. So this would be to help you go and attend the Center for Produce Safety. They are at our booth, where you can talk to my colleague, Ian Bissell. So I know we have lots of students from UF, USF, I think HCC was back there, so plenty of you guys to apply for that. So this morning, I'm going to be talking to you about the Food Safety Modernization Act and how that affects imported foods. Now, there are many parts of the Food Safety Modernization Act that also affect domestic production, and I think what you're going to see is that we're finally, as a country, going to start looking at foreign suppliers to the U.S. and holding them accountable as we do U.S.-based domestic firms. How many of you guys deal with imported products at all? Okay, so a good portion of the audience, and I think that's only going to grow over the next few years. You know, we're starting to have a much more international palate. People are wanting that good nostalgia, maybe from which they came. So we're going to see imported foods continue to grow. And I think Food Safety Modernization Act, a large part of that is just ensuring that we feel just as confident in the safety of the food that we're bringing into the country compared to the food that we're producing here. So just to give you an overview, Food Safety Modernization Act was signed into law January 4th, 2011. And at that point, we're going to go through the timeline in a second, you're going to see that there were powers given to the FDA that actually started upon enactment. This is a new comprehensive food oversight system. This is probably what we would consider the largest and most robust food safety legislation. It's going to result in the most regulations, probably since we had the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in 1938. FSMA covers food for human consumption. It also covers pet foods, which you might be surprised to know is a pretty big part of our imports. It does not cover dietary supplements, but there is a section of FSMA that had the new dietary ingredient draft guidance. We may not bring in a lot of finished dietary supplements from out of the country, but we certainly bring in a lot of raw ingredients for those. Primarily I'm going to talk about imported food today, but because we have some restaurants in the room, we have some grocery stores, I did want to mention one thing that does affect domestic product that actually I just learned about at the National Restaurant Association show. It was a lawyer talking about FSMA and kind of interpretations of some of the rules, and he wanted to address, were there any exemptions? For imports, no, there really are no exemptions. However, for domestically produced product, there's something called the Tester Amendment, and it's exemption for small businesses that have an annual revenue of less than $500,000, and the majority of the food is distributed either directly to the consumer or within a 275-mile radius. So I wanted to bring this up today. The point that the lawyer was making that I watched was that there's almost an implied duty for restaurants or for supermarkets to give information that may not be on that food's label. If it is a small business, if it is a locally distributed product, which the big trend is to buy local, if the processor and address, all that, it does not come on the product label, he was saying there is an implied due diligence by the grocery or restaurant to actually post that information for the consumer. So there is that little amount of trace back. So I just wanted to mention that. It's a little bit different than the imported foods, but I thought some of you guys in the audience might like to hear about that, and if you want to look it up further, it is called the Tester Amendment. All right, so the basis of oversight in the Food Safety Modernization Act is that it's a risk-based approach to food safety. The gist is that the U.S. government is going to be proactive based on inspection of foreign firms and certification of the firms, and in certain cases, the products themselves coming over. This act gave a lot of enforcement authority to the FDA to prevent all types of food safety issues. And we're going to talk about specifically some of the powers that they've gained recently. And really the goal, at least with imported foods, is not only food safety, but also the trade facilitation. And I know that some of you guys might think, well, how do you do both of those at the same time? And I'm sure that's a question that the FDA has been struggling with themselves. There are a lot of hurdles that we're asking foreign firms to jump, but at the same time, if you have all of your ducks in a row, there are programs like the Volunteer Qualified Importer Program that we'll talk about at the end, where you really should be able to show the FDA, here are my inspections, all of my paperwork, my COAs, and be pretty much green-lighted with products into the US. So the expectations for foreign firms, what does the FDA want to see? Well, they're going to have to register just like US firms do. The registration does not cost them money at first. If you have to re-register or have a re-inspection, you will incur some user fees at that point. You have to have a food safety plan. This is for folks producing covered products, is what the FDA says, and those are products that are produced that are not under current juice or seafood HACCP. So you're going to be writing pretty much a HACCP-like plan. That's your food safety plan. And it does follow, you have to have a hazard analysis. I have on here, excuse me, that it has to include allergens, bioterrorism. It's unique in the fact that it's a hazard analysis that has all of the traditional HACCP principles that we all know, plus you have to take into account intentional adulteration of the product. So it's a much more all-encompassing hazard analysis, really, than a traditional HACCP plan. The HACCP plan has to be reanalyzed every 3 years, so they're actually putting that timestamp on it. And you also have to have preventative controls. And one of the other lawyers, I've been listening to a lot of lawyers lately, interpretation of preventative controls will definitely include environmental monitoring and some finished product testing. And the real question is, when FDA comes out with that final regulation, how much guidance is there really going to be? Are they going to give us frequency? Are they going to give us expectations of finished product testing? Again, the good old question of how do you define a lot will probably come back up and be discussed for hours. So any interesting things to think about. But again, it's a HACCP-like plan. FDA expects that product is going to be produced in regards and under the plan that's put forth and compliant with FDA regulations and cannot be adulterated or misbranded. So again, the major goal is that we're holding foreign firms to the same level that we hold domestic processors. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the timeline. Upon enactment in January of 2011, FDA was given a lot of new power. One, to inspect records. And this is one of the most interesting ones in my opinion. What can they really ask you for? Can they ask you for proprietary formulations if they want to see at what level certain ingredients are used because they think there may be a risk there? Can they come in and look at process records, temperature logs? Probably. Can they ask for full access to your computer? That's another interpretation that it gives a very different legal spin to inspection of records. FDA can now collect fees, and we're going to talk about money in a little while. It's a very interesting thing that you can now be charged. You can get a bill from the FDA. FDA now has mandatory recall authority. If you're not, if you didn't know that they didn't have mandatory recall authority before, recalls are voluntary. Believe it or not, the FDA couldn't, they could heavily suggest, but they actually could not initiate a recall on your behalf. Now they have that power. Ability to require import certificates, so to see where that product was made, if it's been rejected from other ports of entry, and any kind of testing, any kind of certificate of analysis. They can inspect foreign food facilities and identify smuggled food, and we'll talk about the definition of smuggled food in a little while too. In July of 2011, we saw new requirements for registration, so the registration of the foreign firms, the new dietary ingredient guidance. What I will say about that, the FDA has never had a very strong position on dietary supplements. They were always kind of in a gray area. The new dietary ingredient guidance, just to give you some background, looks at the active ingredient in a dietary supplement and is almost, it's akin to a new drug application. It's not as rigorous, but you're pretty much applying to have your active ingredient. You're going to show purity. You're going to show off products. You're going to talk about if it's extracted from a botanical, maybe it comes from a leaf of a plant. You're going to show that you're not creating any harmful products during that extraction process. It pretty much gives a safety evaluation or a safety application to the FDA to allow you to use that dietary ingredient as an active ingredient in a supplement. We also see interim and final rule on administrative detention of food. The reasoning or the risk, the apparent risk, actually has dropped for the FDA. They can now just have an idea or a feeling, they can suspect that there is a food safety concern and detain product. Prior to July of 2011, they pretty much had to have some credible evidence, and that's no longer necessary. They can just go on the suspicion. And prior notice required for all imports. Again, if you are an importer and you're bringing in product, let's say the easiest thing to think about is west coast of the US. Maybe you're trying to import cantaloupe. They've already been rejected from Canada, and now the ship's coming down to the US. The US would like to know that the product's been rejected by another country. So that prior notice has to list all the ports of entry that a product has not been allowed to pass through. All right, so January of this year was going to be pretty exciting, and I'll say it was going to be pretty exciting. We were expecting draft standards for fresh produce, guidelines for fresh produce processing, and guidelines on intentional adulteration. We also were expecting a definition for high-risk foods. We did finally get a definition for high-risk foods a little bit later this year. We're going to talk about what that is, but all of the produce standards, I'm sure many folks in this room are frustrated that those have not yet come out. I think people are waiting with bated breath, and from what I've been hearing is we all may be waiting until actually after the election to see those standards. So it should be interesting. February of this year, we saw the interim final rule on records access, and we're waiting for the final regulation to come out, and that should be really soon. And again, that will detail, you know, can the FDA say, I want full access to your computers, I want to see proprietary formulations, I want to come in and take pictures. I mean, they already, I know a lot of FDA inspectors already do carry cameras. They may be able to take a lot more pictures than they try to take now. That's at least what I've been hearing. July of this year, we expect hazard analysis and risk-based control guidance, guidelines on intentional adulteration, because we didn't get those in January, more information about the Volunteer Qualified Importer Program, and again, the most important part of that acronym is voluntary. It's not anything that anybody has to participate in, but we'll talk about why an importer may want to be part of that program a little bit later. We're also going to learn, hopefully this summer, more about the third-party accreditation process. And that accreditation process will talk about accrediting auditors that will go in and look at those foreign firms, and accrediting people like third-party labs for when we do testing on behalf of an importer, what standards are in place to make sure that I am a reputable business. And then January 2013, that's kind of the last time point for FSMA. Hopefully we're going to see the program for accreditation of labs. The traceability standard, right now, as part of FSMA, IFT is working on a pilot study for traceability. We all know under the Bioterrorism Act, we were expected to be able to trace one up and one back. This will be a much more farm to fork version of traceability. And hopefully, I think what they're struggling with right now in traceability is having all of the different software systems or record-keeping systems being able to talk to one another. So actually September, I believe, is when IFT is due to turn their report in on the traceability pilot project to FDA. And then hopefully, if they're on time, January of next year, we'll see what the traceability standard looks like. Foreign supplier verification program should be fully outlined by next January, and we'll talk about all the parts of that. We're going to expand foreign government capacity, so a lot more FDA offices and FDA folks overseas. Recognition of accreditation bodies and accreditation of third parties. So it's kind of in theory, January 2013, we should be wrapping up all of the regulations that we're waiting for with Food Safety Modernization Act. We'll see how well they meet their timeline. Okay, so one of the most interesting things is you can now receive a bill from the FDA. Woohoo, yay. User fees. We don't have anything to talk about now. Okay, you need to go to the bathroom, get coffee, feel free.
What?
So talking about user fees, you can now get a bill from the FDA. What can you be charged for? What services can they provide you that you would actually need to pay for? Reinspection of imported foods. A lot of things can happen when you're trying to bring a product into U.S. commerce. If for some reason there is something wrong, either maybe with the labeling of the product, let's say your nutritional facts panel does not meet U.S. standards, or if you need to recondition the product. And reconditioning of a product, if you're not used to talking about imported foods, means that you're either going to, you may cook the product because of a microbial issue. You can also recondition product by separating certain lot codes from others. So you may be trying to bring in, let's say, 12 different lots of shrimp. 2 are not going to pass FDA inspections. You're going to recondition to say, okay, these 2 are a separate shipment. We're going to deal with those separately. These 10 are now a separate shipment, and I'm going to be allowed to bring in those 10 into commerce. So sometimes there is an actual physical act done to the food. It might be cooking. But sometimes reconditioning is truly fixing your import paperwork and doing that to FDA's liking, where you can get at least a portion of the product into the country. Removal from DWPE. DWPE is detained without physical examination. Importers bringing in certain products that fall under import alerts by the FDA, those products will be stopped at port. Import alerts are documents that the FDA, you can go and you can look them up either by country or by type of product. An import alert is a guidance for the FDA to follow on what food safety risks are associated with a food. This could be antibiotic residue in, let's say, fish coming in from out of the country or shrimp. This might be pesticide residue on snow peas coming into the country. They're documents for compliance officers to reference when they're going to detain a product. Now, sometimes FDA will take a sample of a product, see that, all right, boom, it tests positive for pesticide residue. Now that shipment is detained, but detained repeatedly for some of the antibiotic residues. Let's say you have a very good foreign firm you're working with over there, and you want to get them off of the red list. You want to say, look, consistently I have brought in shipments that are clean. My foreign firm has not had any compliance issues. There is a protocol actually to apply to get off of the red list and get off of detention without physical examination. It's a little bit of a lengthy process. It has to do with testing. It has to do with a lot of paperwork and a lot of review by FDA officials. So they're finally getting paid for the work that they're doing by charging these user fees. And then again, if you bring in product and it needs to be destroyed or condemned, let's say you brought product in, it's stopped, there's antibiotic residue, but you have no choice but to destroy the product or ship it back, refuse shipment. That again does incur time by the FDA to review paperwork, all of that. They're going to be charging you a user fee at this point. If you are a foreign firm and you need to have a reinspection, so you've registered with the FDA, which you're expected to do under FSMA, for some reason you've had a compliance issue. You may have had product that's come over and been tested and for some reason has elicited a food safety response from the FDA. Not only are you going to be, your registration will be suspended during this time, you're also going to have to pay for them to come back in and re-inspect you. You don't pay for your first inspection as a foreign firm, but you will pay for everyone after that. And just something interesting, just kind of keep in the back of your head. How long is it going to take them to get to your foreign firm in whatever country and show up and give you that re-inspection and give you a clean letter that you can give to the people you're selling to? So not only are you going to be charged a user fee, you're also kind of going to be sitting on your hands waiting for the FDA to have time to get an inspector in there and re-inspect your facility. So even though we talk about FSMA, we talk about food safety and the facilitation of trade, there is definitely a cost of doing business, and it might actually be that your business isn't up and running for a little while. Recalls. FDA now has the power to initiate a recall. They also have the power that if you force them to mandate that you recall product, not only will you can be charged per person involved in the recall or per entity, and I think it's $50,000 per person, US dollars, $250,000 per entity. The maximum, they did put a maximum on it, is $500,000 in fees for a mandated recall, plus you're going to pay them per hour user fees. If you're wondering what those user fees are, $224 per hour per FDA personnel for domestic, and $325 per hour per person for international work. So these could be, 2 or 3 inspectors going into your foreign firm to do a reinspection. This could be review of documentation to get you off of DWPE lists. There's just one fee for domestic, one fee for international, but it's per hour per person. So you could see how it really starts to add up. You may be wondering who's going to get the bill in the mail and who's going to be, whose feet are going to be held to the fire. You do have to register as a foreign firm, but more specifically, you have to have a U.S. agent that's going to receive the bill from the FDA. Obviously, the FDA, knows that they can't chase after folks across the seas. They want somebody on U.S. soil that they're going to look at and say, cough over the money, cough up the money. Also, suspension of registration. I did talk about that just a little bit. What people are expecting right now, suspension of registration, they say you should be, as a foreign firm, you should be ready to not be producing between a month to 6 months. So that means sitting idle, not able to export to the U.S. And you can imagine that is a major, major issue for a lot. It would be a major issue for a lot of domestic firms to be shut down for a month or, God forbid, 6 months. All right, talking about inspection of food facilities. FDA will ask you for your safety plan. So this is your HACCP-like plan that they want you to provide. Specific rules on this hopefully will be out by the end of 2012, and then implementation is January 2013 for the food safety plans. They must include preventative controls. They must be risk-based. Again, it's HACCP on steroids pretty much. And again, issues that will require reinspection. Pretty much FDA could nail you for anything. They're going to want to see corrective actions. They're going to want to see changes when they come in to do that reinspection. And it should be also reflected in your food safety plan. All right, mandatory recall authority. Adulterated or misbranded foods are grounds for a mandatory recall. I don't think that FDA is going to exercise that. I don't think they're going to have to exercise it. I think that most folks are still going to go for a voluntary recall. If FDA is looking at you and highly suggesting you do it, I can't imagine saying no. But if they have to, FDA will initiate a recall, they will publicize it, and then they will bill you. All right, another one of the enforcement activities given to FDA upon enactment of the Food Safety Modernization Act was a definition for smuggled food. And smuggled food is any food brought into the U.S. through fraudulent means or brought in with the intent to defraud or mislead. From a food safety perspective, pretty much I think you think about traditional adulteration. This also can be economic adulteration. If you're talking about seafood, is your grouper sandwich really grouper? Is one of those things you have to ask. So I think we're going to see a lot more species identification testing on seafood. Especially, I know in recent years there have been a lot of investigations on the amount of domestic vaname, white shrimp produced, and the amount of domestic products sold. Guess what? We're selling a lot more product labeled domestic than we actually grow. So there's something fishy going on there, no pun intended. What's going to be interesting about smuggled food or food brought in to defraud is that now it's a criminal investigation. And that's the power of the FDA's game. We now have a definition for smuggled food, and it's a criminal investigation. That's two parts. It's between FDA and Customs and Border Protection. All right, administrative detention. We just talked a little bit about detention without physical examination, and the FDA has had that power for years, the ability to stop product at port if they have evidence or, if they have evidence that there is a food safety risk. And the evidence also had to be presented before an import alert could be written. Now, with FSMA, FDA just has to suspect adulteration or misbranding. They don't actually have to have a written import alert to detain product at port. This gives them a lot more leeway. I personally think it's very, very subjective. So you get maybe a brand new compliance officer and they're just ready to go out there and detain. It could be very interesting to be an importer over the next couple of years. With this newfound power, the ability to detain can be 20 days, up to 20 calendar days of detaining the product, which if you could imagine, you have frozen food coming into this country, that's a lot of money you're going to put out. One, for the product not to be released into commerce, you're not filling orders, and two, you're paying for freezer space to maintain the integrity of the product. So 20 days, and then they can actually hold the product an additional 10 calendar days to because of either seizure or they're trying to get an injunction. So, I mean, you could be out a month holding product in freezers, not being able to fill orders because they suspect there might be something wrong. Now, during this time, obviously, you would have the ability, based on the compliance officer's permission, to go in and sample. Hopefully, if you could test your way out of the situation, show that the product is clean, or go in, recondition product by, changing your label if your label is not up to snuff. You're going to have options to do all of those things, but again, it's a lot of time and it's a lot of money that changes the game for the importer. Okay, and again, prior notification. It requires importers to let the U.S. know where the products come from, where the product's been, and who didn't like it. So when importers and brokers and freight forwarders are putting all of their information into the Customs and Border Protection system, they're electronically uploading all of this information, they will have to say, yeah, I tried to bring the product into Canada, the Canadians refused it, and now it's making its way down and it's going to come into LA. That, I think, is going to be a big red flag for the FDA, especially with us in Canada. I don't think it will happen too much with any other ports of entry. Probably Canada will be our biggest culprit for that. All right, facility registration. We talked about this a little bit. Under the Bioterrorism Act, processors had to register biannually and denote a U.S. agent. That's not too different. However, now, because we're asking foreign firms to register, the minute that you're red flagged for anything in the system, your product's going to be stopped at port. So whether you need a reinspection, whether you've been placed on a red list on an import alert, for whatever reason, if you've been flagged in the system, anything you're trying to bring into this country from that foreign firm is going to be stopped. Okay, one of the most interesting definitions that we've gotten from Food Safety Modernization Act has been defining a high-risk food. This is the schematic put out to kind of try and figure out whether you have a high-risk food or a high-risk foreign firm that processes. This is probably a little bit hard to read in the back. So, okay, are you required to register as a processor for FDA? Yes, pretty much anybody would be. Second question that's asked, identify known safety risk of the food. Is it a food commodity category associated with outbreaks or Class 1 recalls? If you answer yes to that question, the box with the dashed line around it, facility manufactures a food commodity category associated with outbreaks and Class 1 recalls within the previous 5 fiscal years, or your facility manufactures a food commodity category associated with outbreaks or Class 1 recalls not inspected within the last 5 years. Either way, you answer yes to those, you're a high risk, it's either a high-risk food or you may be classified as a high-risk facility for processing that food. If neither one of those is true, they ask about your compliance history, whether you've either had violations or you've been non-compliant in the last 5 years. So you can see that high-risk food is not only based on maybe the innate food safety risk of the food, but also kind of, you know, you're rewarded for good behavior and punished for bad. So any compliance issues, you may be put into that high-risk category. What I think will be interesting is if you are coming down into the loop where the FDA is looking at your compliance history, I think that opens up a whole slew of how do I petition now that, you know, for the last 5 fiscal years I've been on good behavior, can I get my firm off of a high-risk firm list? That's going to be an interesting question. For the folks that will fall under the high-risk foods and high-risk firms, you're expected to be inspected within the first 5 years of Food Safety Modernization Act, and then every 3 years thereafter. Now, to compare that to a non-high-risk firm, non-high-risk firms have to be inspected within the first 7 years of FSMA, and then every 5 years thereafter. So you do get inspected on a higher frequency. As an importer of a high-risk food, FDA is going to expect you to provide a certificate from a verifiable entity like a third-party lab. For instance, if you're bringing in soft cheese and there's an E. coli and staph concern on that product, they're going to want to see a COA from a third party. And again, this can be based on food safety risk, country of origin, or if the FDA is going out and actually sampling and testing, it can be based on lab results that the FDA has gotten on their own. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the food safety plan, and that FDA wants a science-based risk analysis. This is going to include environmental controls, sanitation, how to recall, supplier certifications and verifications. And I think that last part, the supplier certifications and verifications, will probably be one of the things that foreign firms will struggle with the most. Looking at their supply chain, and depending on the country of origin, the supply chain of, let's say, dried spices, that you might be getting that from 15 different people in that area and bringing all those spices in. I think that's going to be one of the things, the record keeping for looking at the supply chain for the foreign firms is going to be very, very different than what we're used to. And really, what is the difference between this and HACCP? I called it HACCP on steroids. The biggest deal is that non-compliance is a criminal act now. FDA has gotten a lot of enforcement power, and a lot of that will be, not only can we charge you fees, you can also go to jail. Okay, so the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, that is just a fancy term for the fact that it's all the paperwork that's going to provide assurances to FDA that the product you're importing complies with FSMA. So this is going to be, your food safety plan. It's going to be monitoring records from that foreign firm. It may be certificates of analysis that you've shown finished product testing, that the product does not have whatever that food safety concern is from the FDA. It's required for imports, all imported product except for products that already fall under low-acid canned foods and juice and seafood HACCP. And importers must maintain records for at least 2 years. Okay, options for penalties. Again, suspended registration. If your registration is suspended as a foreign firm, if you're talking about the time it takes to get something from China over into U.S. ports, it could be 3 weeks easily on a ship. During that 3 weeks, let's say your registration is suspended, and your importer may not have been notified because you haven't exactly told them. When product comes in, it's going to get a USA rejected stamp on the product. And they mean a stamp literally, and they mean a stamp on any electronic records. So imagine your importer in the U.S. is going to go, all right, thanks, foreign firm A. Can't take your product in because your registration has been suspended. I'm going to refuse shipment. So at that point, the foreign firm then has to accept product back and has to try to send it somewhere else with a USA rejected stamp on it. It's not going to be fun. So that's one of the reasons it's such a question of, does the FDA have the staff and the time to be able to turn a reinspection around quickly for a foreign firm, or will they be out, 1 or 2 months waiting for it? Seizures of product, injunctions, FDA definitely has that power, and again, they've had that power in the past, but now this is based on suspicion of food safety risk, not of hard evidence. FDA, again, has had import alerts written, but now has a little bit more leeway in what they can add to an import alert. It can be a little bit more all-encompassing. Civil penalties, we've talked a little bit about the fees for a recall. Civil penalties can go from $10,000 up to $100,000. And then again, prosecution, criminal prosecution, either based on smuggled food or issues with noncompliance under your food safety plan. Something positive that is coming out for importers, it sounds like a lot of negatives so far, but something positive that we're going to hear more about later this year is the Volunteer Qualified Importer Program. You'll notice I don't have much on my slide about it because we haven't heard details about it, but this is the trade facilitation portion of FSMA. This is going to allow an importer to jump through certain hoops and hopefully have all their ducks in a row, be able to show their paperwork, their food safety plan, be rewarded for good behavior, show the FDA, look, we're a good foreign supplier to the U.S., we produce clean, reliable product, and they would pretty much have a green light coming in through any of the U.S. ports. So this again, this is the trade facilitation point. But I think that it's going to be a fair program, and I think that this will probably be the gold standard. If you buy a lot of imported food, if you buy a large amount of imported food, you're gonna want people to be part of the VQuip. So again, steps for compliance. I don't know. I would just say sit back with open ears and be ready to read a lot. Determine what part of FSMA affects your products. We're talking about when the final regulations come out, thousands and thousands of pages to go through. And I know when I read FDA documents, I read them and I read them again, and then I read them again, and it all comes down to interpretation. So understanding how FSMA affects you, how FSMA affects your suppliers and their supply chain, which obviously is your supply chain, that's going to be one of the toughest things. And I said I've been listening to a lot of lawyers lately. I've seen a lot of lawyers give presentations. I think we should be listening to the lawyers. I think a good, sound legal counsel, if you import a lot of food, is a good thing to take service from. And then again, working with FDA and counsel to represent your interests to FDA. I think that there are going to be a lot of opportunities for people to petition to get off of certain lists and on to others. And I think that everybody's going to be new to the game, even including FDA. They're going to have written the guidance, but again, it's all interpretation. So I think there will be a little bit of wiggle room in there, and a lot of petitioning opportunity. So there you have it. I hopefully gave you a decent overview of FSMA, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you guys have.